can apply for this financing in the form of tax credits, which is like equity, so they don't have to pay a mortgage loan on that money. But they have to make certain commitments in exchange for getting this source of financing, equity financing. And one of those commitments is that they have to provide affordable housing to low and moderate income households. Now, the issue is that even when they meet that commitment, the rents for the units provided in tax credit units are typically set for residents that are within a certain income range or ranges. And those rents may still be higher than what a single person on SSI or SSDI can afford without rental assistance. So that's why we have SRAP and vouchers, to be able to help people get into those units and qualify based on their income and rent assistance that they have. Now, the beauty is that most all of our tax credit properties accept rent assistance. So it's not even a question. So that will narrow down the search quite a bit. The other beauty of this is that some tax credit properties have a preference for people with developmental disabilities in the settlement agreement population. So what I mean by a preference here, in this case it's a leasing preference, is that when a person in the settlement agreement applies to one of these properties, select properties that has a preference, their application for certain available units is going to be considered before anybody else's application. So that gives people basically, I guess, a leg up in terms of trying to apply for rental housing. In these tax credit properties, there is sometimes rent assistance attached. So some properties actually have a form of project-based rent assistance, and if you apply for the unit and you qualify, you're going to get the benefit of the rent assistance while you live in that unit. Other apartments, as I mentioned before, really don't have rent assistance attached, and that's how people can get SRAP or their special admissions voucher to help pay rent in some of these unassisted units. So as of July, we have 134 properties in Virginia that have these kinds of leasing preferences. Not all of these properties are quite ready for occupancy. Some of them are new construction or significant rehabs, but they'll be coming available within the next year or two. And over 750 units in these 134 properties are going to be made available to people with developmental disabilities who are in the settlement agreement population on a priority or a preferential basis. And the good news is, because this is now a requirement in the tax credit application that people must, or that applicants must provide this preference, each year we're going to find more projects are getting funding to develop rental properties with leasing preferences in Virginia, throughout Virginia. So if you would like to learn more about how to access a tax credit property or unit that has a leasing preference, I encourage you to contact your DVHDS Regional Housing Coordinator, the folks that are in my position, and I'll be sharing their information at the end of the presentation. So how do I apply for these resources? Whether it's the special admissions preference vouchers or the state rental assistance program or the tax credit units that have leasing preferences. Well, it's important to note that the department only accepts referral packages from support coordinators and case managers. And this may be your DD support coordinator with the Community Services Board, or if you have a support coordinator that is an agency that's contracted with the CSB, we'll accept referrals from them as well. And a referral package consists of three different things. The first is that there is a housing referral and assessment. That housing referral and assessment tells us at the department whether the person is in the target population, and it identifies where they want to live so we can make sure that they have one or more of those resources we just talked about available to them. And it's our chance to be able to understand whether this person has done everything to prepare to be able to move into housing and maintain stable housing. So we are going to be looking at things like, does the person have all of their required documentation to get rent assistance and move into rental housing? And that's things like birth certificates, social security cards, government photo IDs, bank statements, statements of income, whether it's from an employer or the Social Security Administration, things like that. We're also going to look at what their credit history is, because if they have very poor or no credit, they're going to encounter some challenges to getting into housing that we need to walk through in advance. We're going to look at whether they are going to have a livable budget when they live in rental housing, because to be honest, there are people who have very limited incomes, and even with rent assistance, they still may face challenges to affording some of their basic necessities: food, utilities, phone, household supplies, clothing, transportation, those types of things. We want to make sure that we are not moving somebody from maybe a stable but less optimal housing environment to an optimal but very unstable housing environment, because the last thing we want to do is put people at risk of losing the housing that they get. So we're going to take very careful looks at people's budgets for what their income and expenses will be when they move into housing with rent assistance, and talk with them through ways that they don't have the income that they need to be able to get alternative sources of assistance to increase their income or to decrease their expenses. The other major thing we look at in this referral and assessment is whether people have arranged the supports that they are going to need to be able to move into housing. And this is really critical for people who are on the waiver wait list. People who are on the waiver wait list often have to look at sort of piecing together other kinds of supports that will assist them until the point that they get a waiver. So some people have used supports like the CCC Plus waiver if they have nursing needs, to be able to use that personal care assistance service in the CCC Plus waiver to assist with being able to maintain housing and take care of daily living needs. Some folks have used, if they have a co-occurring mental health diagnosis, some folks have been able to access mental health skill building through state Medicaid plans. And that also can help with not just the ADLs, but more of that skill building and managing of medications and things like that to make sure that people can be safe in their housing. Some folks have already established special needs trusts or ABLE accounts, and those can be used to help cover the cost to private pay for certain services people need until the point that they get selected off of the wait list to get a waiver. Other folks have used Medicaid's early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment program to pay for personal care assistance and things like that. So we're not expecting you to know about all of these things right now, but what you do need to know is when you submit that referral and assessment, we're going to be looking to see that people have the supports that they're going to need. And if they don't, we're going to be talking with them about how to plan for those. The next form that folks are going to be submitting as part of their referral package is called the Housing Action Plan. And the Housing Action Plan basically is the plan where the red flags that we identified in the referral and assessment process get addressed. And we start outlining what it is we're going to do to overcome those barriers or those challenges, or prepare to make sure that the person's going to have a safe transition to housing and is going to maintain stability in housing. So the Housing Action Plan is going to look at, if the person doesn't have good credit, what are we going to do to improve their credit score? What are we going to do if they need a cosigner? What are we going to do if the person needs to work off some of the debts that they have, or if their debts are medical related, what are we going to do to ask for reasonable accommodations, which are exceptions to programs rules, to be able to make sure that landlords don't consider things that are medical expenses when they are looking at a person's qualifications to rent housing. We're also going to be looking in the Housing Action Plan at, have you set up your household? So we, for a long time, for a while back there, we were getting referrals of people who would say, oh yes, I'm going to have a roommate, and I'm going to have a person who is a live-in aide who's going to be helping me with certain tasks and activities. And then we would say, okay, well, who are these people? What are their names? And they would tell us, oh, well, we haven't figured that part out yet. Well, we can't move a referral forward unless we know who's in the household, because if you try to add people to the household after you've been referred or you rent with a housing resource, there are real barriers to doing that. So we want to make sure that you kind of thought through who you're going to live with up front, that those conversations with the potential housemates and roommates and live-in aides have been had, and that there's agreement so that we can make sure that everybody gets referred all at the same time, and those supports are going to be in place when people move. The other thing we look at are those sort of more formal service supports. If a person doesn't have help to pay the rent on time and they need that, or their utilities on time, if they don't have the assistance that they're going to need to be able to go shopping, learn to prepare meals, manage their medications, things like that, we're going to look at that and say, okay, well, what's the game plan here? If you don't have a waiver, what's going to be doing this in the meantime? Who's going to be supporting you in the meantime? Because it's really never that a person isn't ready to move into independent housing, meaning they don't know how to do it. It's really about whether they have the supports to be able to do it. And we want to make sure that we don't ever transition someone into housing without the supports that they believe they need to be successful. The last part of the package is a financial need form. And this form is really only used if a person already lives in rental housing and perhaps they're struggling because they're rent burdened. We basically have people put in information about what their expenses are, and we determine whether they're paying more than 50% of their monthly income toward their housing expenses. And if that's the case, then they're going to be one of our priorities. So speaking of priorities, let's talk about our referral priorities. So our very first referral priority is people who are in segregated settings, such as training centers, immediate care facilities, nursing facilities, and group homes. This would also include people in assisted living. Our second priority is people who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, at risk of abuse or neglect, as it's been documented by the Adult Protective Services, or who are paying more than half of their income toward rent. And that's the reason for the financial need form. And the third priority is people who live with their families. So to be honest, you might look at this and go, oh man, my family member who lives with me is never going to get a chance to apply for or get assistance from rental subsidies and sources. But the truth is we have very few people in priorities 1 and 2. So we are almost always going directly to priority 3. And that means that while we have rental assistance resources available, people are going to get selected off of our wait list very quickly. So housing assistance is not like the waiver. You are not going to be waiting for years and years and years. You might be waiting for several months at this time, but that would be the maximum. So you need to be prepared to act if you submit a housing referral. All right, so when DVHDS, my office, gets a referral, we basically review it to make sure that people are in the settlement agreement population, that they have the financial stability to be able to rent housing, they have the needed supports to ensure their health and safety and their ability to follow the rules of their lease, and that they have all the documents they're going to need to be able to apply for both rent assistance and then the housing. We also look to make sure that they have an allowable household composition because, as we mentioned, at the very beginning, these housing resources do not allow people to live with their parents, grandparents, and guardians because the whole point is helping people leave the nest. And we're going to look to see if the person has any kinds of historical barriers to renting, meaning that they have an eviction on their history or they have debts owed to landlords, or they have they've been in multiple residential placements, and they sometimes we learn that people may have difficulty living in groups or living in certain kinds of settings or with housing that has certain features. So we're going to look at those things and make sure we've got a plan to address them in advance. So once we've reviewed these referrals and we've had some back and forth with the support coordinator and their individual and family, we will approve those referrals to be moved along. And that's when individuals get referred to the local housing administrator that administers the specific resource we're referring them to, like housing choice vouchers, state rental assistance, tax credit properties, and then they will begin the application process for that rental assistance resource. So, in summary, this is a two-part process. The first part is all about the planning and preparation, and that's the referral process. Then, once the referral is moved to the housing agency, that's when the application to make sure you're eligible for the actual program you're being referred to begins. So, another resource that I want to tell you about, we've talked about now the referral process to the special admissions vouchers, state rental assistance, and tax credit programs. And now I want to talk to you about a resource that helps people in a settlement agreement overcome some of the financial hurdles to getting into independent housing. So remember that, people who are on SSI or Medicaid cannot have more than $2,000 in assets, or they're rendered ineligible for those assistance programs. So it's very difficult for people with developmental disabilities to save up the resource they need to be able to afford all of those expenses that come when you move from wherever you are into rental housing. Things like your application fee for rent for apartments, any holding fee that the apartment property requires to keep the unit off the market while they're processing your application, security deposits, utility deposit and connection fees, first month's rent, basic furniture to be able to move into your home and live in it and use it, like a bed and a dresser and a table and chairs and maybe a sofa, but the basics, and basic household supplies like dishes, silverware, pots and pans, things like that. And in some cases, it's those expenses related to getting assistive technology or environmental modifications like ramps or lowered doorbells or grab bars or things like that that aren't covered by another resource. For example, people on the waiver wait list don't have access to environmental mods and assistive technology services through the waiver. So this flexible funding can help them offset the costs of those things. So flexible funding requests are only accepted by DD support coordinators. So a person who's interested in flexible funding, whether they're using one of our housing resources or whether they're just renting on their own, should go to their support coordinators and let them know what expenses, upfront expenses they're having trouble paying to get into housing. And the support coordinator can help them fill out an application for flexible funding. Now, there's another part to flexible funding, and that's for the people once they get into housing and maybe at risk of losing their housing. And there's some limits to this part of the funding, but there's a separate, for the initial transition, you have up to $5,000 available to you to expend on those various categories of need that we talked about. In flexible funding for people maintaining housing, there is also up to $5,000. And that $5,000 can be used to cover emergency rent payments. Let's say your SSI got cut off because you went back to work and the housing agency that you're working with hasn't yet processed your change in income, so now you still owe a bunch of money. So you need a one-time emergency rent payment to cover what the gap is. Same thing for utility assistance. If a person is getting utility shutoff notices, we can help them with utility assistance. We can help them with household management activities. For example, let's say you move into housing and suddenly you get a huge pest infestation. We can help pay for that. We can help pay for unit repairs or damages to keep you from becoming non-compliant with your lease and losing your housing. So if you get a notice from your landlord that says you've got 21 days to fix the hole you have in your wall that you made, or you have 30 days to leave the unit, we can help with paying for the cost to repair that damage. We also can help pay for temporary relocation. If somebody's unit gets flooded, then they may need to stay in a hotel for a week or two while they fix the unit. We can help pay for those things. In all cases, when we're talking about people who are at risk of losing their housing, there has to be documentation of that risk. And that documentation could be something like a 5-day pay or quit notice, or a utility shutoff notice, or a lease violation notice, things like that. And when people have these issues that come up in their housing, what we're going to ask them to do is create a housing stability plan to address those circumstances that created the instability, because we're not going to be able to provide ongoing emergency rent payments. There has to be some plan to get back to baseline so that the person can afford their own rent. So we're going to ask for what that plan is and what the steps the person and their team is going to take. So these flexible funding requests also are only accepted by DD support coordinators and case managers, whether it's the initial transition to housing or the portion that is about maintaining your housing. Oh, one other thing about flexible funding as it relates to the initial transition, I can't emphasize this enough. You can't hoard your $5,000 and only spend $2,500 this year, and then in 3 years, if you choose to move to somewhere else, use the remaining $2,500. It is truly for the initial transition from the less integrated setting into a more integrated setting. So people need to understand that if they want to, after a year, move, then that next security deposit, that next rental application fee, the next moving expenses are going to be on their dime. So it's really important to help people understand that so that they can work towards saving if they're going to need to make another transition. All right, we sort of covered this a little bit. We talked a little bit about where supports and housing can come from. Like we said, Medicaid waivers, all 3 waivers have supports that can be used in independent housing. Just as a quick aside, it's really important to note that you can't get one of our housing resources if you live in a group home or a licensed setting, which would include a group home, sponsored residential services, or supportive living services. But if you are receiving services like in-home support, personal assistance services, companion services, independent living supports, then you are welcome to be able to use rental assistance to help pay for your housing. We talked through the CCC Plus waiver as an option, Medicaid's EPSDP program for young adults, Medicaid mental health skill building and private paying for services using ABLE accounts, resources and ABLE accounts or special needs trusts. Another thing that we didn't talk about that much, but that is live-in aids. And live-in aids are not necessarily a service that is coming from a waiver, although they can be. A live-in aid is really more an accommodation or an exception to the rules in the rent assistance program that basically allow a person with a disability who needs essential care and supports to live in their own housing to have somebody live with them that is their sole purpose for living with them is to provide those essential care and supports. So essential care and supports could range from somebody who is staying overnight in a unit that's going to help that person in the middle of the night if they get anxious or if they have to evacuate their unit because of a fire alarm, or who needs some assistance in the middle of the night with personal care, or to somebody who may need somebody who's going to help them take their medications every day in the morning and the evening, someone who's going to help prepare meals for that person, somebody who's going to help them with, bathing, dressing, grooming, etc., things like that. So what the rent assistance program will do in those cases is it will provide enough subsidy to cover an extra bedroom specifically for the live-in aid, so the live-in aid can have their own bedroom when living with the person. And the person's home becomes the live-in aid's primary home, that they have to be there occupying that unit 24/7. So the great part about this is that the live-in aid doesn't have to pay rent in order to be able to remain in that unit as long as they are providing the agreed upon essential care and support. One great way to be able to do this is to pair the accommodation or the exception to get a live-in aid so they get their rent paid, plus one of the Medicaid waivers, for example, consumer-directed services like consumer-directed personal assistance. Then the live-in aid can get paid for their hours to do the work because they need to be paid under fair labor law, at least minimum wage for the hours that they work. And they can get the additional benefit of having a free place to live as long as they're providing those supports. So it certainly gives you bigger bang for your buck when you have somebody who's providing personal care on the waiver rate who can also get rent assistance to be able to offset their costs of housing. Other things that folks should be looking at in terms of supports and housing are just community resources that anybody can access, depending on sometimes their income or their eligibility population-wise. And these would be programs like Meals on Wheels, local homemaker or chore services, or sometimes friendly visitor programs where folks will stop by and just check in on a person and see how they're doing. And last but not least, representative payees can be a really essential support to make sure that people's rent and utilities are always paid, so their housing is never at risk. So a couple of success stories so we can get to some questions. You're going to see 3 people here, and one of the folks who is pictured here, who is at the looks like the ice cream bar, Sweet Frog. Her name is Caitlin Williams, and she's done something really interesting. Her mom had a condo unit that really was to house her Caitlin's grandmother. Grandmother passed away, so they were wondering what to do with this housing unit, and they decided that they were going to become the landlord and have Caitlin apply to live in that unit and get rent assistance through the state rental assistance program to pay for that unit. They asked for a reasonable accommodation for an exception to have a live-in aide, and Caitlin got a live-in aide who lives with her, who also bills the CCC Plus waiver for personal attendant care services. And so Caitlin now lives in her own condo, and she rents it from her family in SRAP. SRAP will allow you to do that. In the voucher program, it's a little more difficult, but in SRAP, people can actually rent from family as long as they're not living with family. And so Caitlin really enjoys, her condo in the middle of Falls Church and is thriving, living in a very, very busy, active community. So down here we have Mr. Kearns, and Mr. Kearns is pictured with his support coordinator. Mr. Kearns actually moved from a housing property that received certain kind of rental assistance because he was looking for a more accessible unit, more accessible property to meet his needs. So he was granted a housing choice voucher and moved to a more accessible property. And he's now increased his hours of personal assistance under the waiver and got some environmental mods to be able to make his unit even more customized and accessible to his needs. And he's living independently, I believe in the Gainesville area of Virginia. And our last folks up here, I'm drawing a blank on names, I apologize. But our last folks are, Pete. This is Pete and this is Chris. And so Pete also wanted to live in Arlington, moving out of his family's home. He received a special admissions choice voucher, a one-time voucher that Arlington made available to be able to move into a tax credit property. He moved into a tax credit property that doesn't have a leasing preference, but he was able to qualify on his own. So he moved in and also requested through the voucher program and the tax credit property, the ability to have a live-in caregiver, which is Chris. And Chris and Pete have been friends since, their elementary school days. And so Chris helps Pete with things like, prompting them to get chores done and taking them shopping, and they both cook together, helps them, sort of navigate some of the problems if the unit needs a repair or maintenance, things like that. And they've been living in the Ballston area of Arlington for several years now. All right, so last but not least, I just want to leave you with a couple of links for resources. This first one has video testimonials and success stories of people who have moved into integrated independent housing, so you can kind of, share those with individuals so that they can get a feel of what life might be like living in their own rental housing with supports that they need. This video on AT, assistive technology, features several individuals who have taken advantage of different types of assistive technology to help them live as independently as possible in their own units. We have a guidebook on our website, our DBHDS housing page, that talks about innovative family-driven housing arrangements. And last but not least, we have a guidebook that talks about how to take those steps to prepare to move into independent housing. So I encourage you to take advantage of those resources. Last but not least, who you contact. So here's the contact information for those regional housing coordinators that we talked about. They are all listed here by DBHDS region. I'm up here in the yellow part, that's region 2, and my colleagues and compatriots are in these other regions, and I'm going to give you something that's a little easier to read on the eyes so that you actually have their names, phone numbers, and email addresses. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Tanya.
That was a wonderful amount of information. Thank you so much. Very thorough. We are close to being to the end, but we do have a lot of questions in the chat box, and I will ask just a couple, and any we don't get to, I will have those saved to see if there are any themes or things we need to come back to. First, I just want to ask, one question was a clarifying question from someone in the audience about the allowance for people in group homes. And I wanted to clarify that I believe you were saying that funding, housing funding couldn't be used for someone in a group home, but that meant for them to live in a group home. It would be okay for them to use that funding to come out of a group home, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
That was misunderstood, so I just wanted to make sure I had that right. So the other thing was from Janelle. She asked a question about how long the subsidies can last, and would she ever be in a position to pay it back, or would it last through the years?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. Once you are eligible, you remain eligible unless something in your situation changes your eligibility. So these are, so for example, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is in the federal-based budget. The state rental assistance program is in the state's-based budget. So once you get funded, you have to do something that is not in compliance with the program rules in order to get kicked out. So the two ways that you could look at this is you're either going to get kicked out because your income is going to increase so much that you're no longer going to be financially eligible, or you're going to do something to break the program rules. For example, you're not going to report your income when it changes, or you're going to have multiple lease violations or things like that. You're going to have people who are living in your unit that shouldn't be there, that weren't approved. If you do those things, you will lose your rental assistance, but you will not lose your rental assistance if you remain in compliance with your eligibility requirements and the program's rules.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Last question is about marriage. And if two people are married, are they allowed to apply and utilize voucher funding, housing funding?
Yes, just be aware that because they are a household, we look at both vouchers and state rental assistance, all look at combined household income. So if an individual is married to somebody with a very high income, they may no longer be eligible. So in order to be eligible for most of these rental assistance programs, the household as a whole cannot have more than 50% of the area median income and qualify. And 50% of the area median income varies dramatically from Northern Virginia down to Big Stone Gap. So I can't give you the exact numbers of what the income limit would be, but again, call your housing coordinators, because they can help you sort of puzzle through that to make sure that a married couple would be eligible financially.
Okay. And is that housing coordinator or those coordinators, is that where someone would find out how many vouchers are available in a certain area? Someone asked earlier if you knew how many were available in Richmond. So for example, is that how they would find that out?
That's right, because you have to remember that there's the number of subsidies that have been funded, but then there is a portion of those subsidies that are already utilized. So there's only going to be a certain number left. The housing coordinators can tell you whether there are any subsidies left in your area and for which program.
Okay. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending this time, giving us all of this information, and we will have your slides and your presentation. A lot of people ask about that in the chat, so that tells you how meaningful and important this information is, Jeannie. So thank you. And we will have this on the convention website later this week. Yes, ma'am?
Great. Just one other plug. So I realize that many people need to hear this information several times before it starts to become meaningful. And there are some areas where people may have questions that are really specific to live-in aids, roommates, creative housing approaches, things like that. DBHDS, the Office of Community Housing, and the Individual and Family Support Program are offering a series of virtual housing conferences that are going to cover this general information we just talked about, as well as have a couple of breakouts that will tackle specific issues like how to prepare for housing, live-in aids and roommates, and creative housing approaches. So I encourage you, if you're interested, feel free to email me and I'll send you the flyer for that so you can sign up for one of those sessions.
Oh, that's great. And I'll look for that flyer too and see if I can post it with your presentation on our convention website, just as another reminder for folks. So, yeah. And everybody else, thank you for coming. And remember, at 7 o'clock is our keynote address from Mary Gonzalez, who's going to talk about advocacy and community organizing. So, thank you. Everyone have a good night.